Secret to the grave. Paul grew up in a small, struggling neighborhood in the city. His family was poor, but his mother always told him, "God has a plan for you." Paul believed her. He worked hard, studied the Bible, and became a preacher. His charisma and powerful sermons quickly drew people to him. Soon, he became the head pastor of a large church. People admired him, and his fame spread. But as his power grew, so did his pride. He began to feel untouchable, as if the rules didn't apply to him. Mrs. Mercy, his wife, stood by him through it all. She was a kind and devoted woman who believed in Paul's mission. But she noticed changes in him. He stayed out late, often claiming he was at church meetings or visiting members. She trusted him, but deep down, she felt something was wrong. One night, she had a dream. In it, she saw Paul surrounded by darkness, with many women crying out to him. She woke up shaken and warned him, "Paul, be careful. God sees everything." But Paul laughed it off. "You worry too much," he said. "I'm doing God's work." Paul's first sin happened when Anita, a young girl from the church, came to him for counseling. She was only 16 and struggling with family issues. Paul took advantage of her vulnerability. Looking at her lustfully, he walked up to where she was seated. He placed his hands around her. What seems like harmless counseling turned into something else. He began to molest her. At first she was confused by the act of the pastor. She later became comfortable with him. Paul began to give her lots of money and expensive gifts. He continued to abuse her for months. When she became pregnant, he threatened her to keep quiet. Anita was terrified and confused. Anita's parents were elders of the church. They'd reported Anita to the pastor. If she could at least open up to someone about the person that impregnated her. Pastor scolded her gently and he asked for one-on-one discussion with her while the parents excused them. This time Pastor Paul pleaded with her to keep it a secret and he promised to take care of her and the child to any length. Few months later, she gave birth to a son, Victor. Paul kept his words. He silently took care of the child. He gave Anita money for her academics and other stuff. After the birth of Victor, Paul and Anita began seeing in private again, as she was so good in keeping the secret, although Anita lived in shame among her peers and in the community while Paul continued preaching as if nothing had happened. Paul's affair with Anita was just the beginning. He began to seduce women in the church, starting with the choir leader. Cynthia, a beautiful singer, was the first to fall for his charm. He told her, "God has brought us together." She believed him. Soon, they began having an affair. Other choir members like Emanuela, Beatrice, and Susan also became his mistresses. Paul used his position to manipulate them, making them feel special. He would meet them in his church office for some quickie and blow jobs or a threesome with random ladies in his private guest house. He was always careful to avoid suspicion. His church secretary and mistress Ruth was his steady catch. She was always there for him to comfort him in distress. The affairs didn't stop there. Paul also targeted widows in the church, like Abigail, Evelyn, and Deborah. He would visit them under the guise of offering spiritual support. They were lonely and vulnerable, and Paul took advantage of their trust. They often meet secretly in their apartment or his private guest house. His wife, Mrs. Mercy, began to notice his late nights and strange behavior. She confronted him, but Paul always had an excuse. "I'm busy with God's work," he would say. Mrs. Mercy prayed for him, but her heart grew heavier with each passing day. One of Paul's mistresses, Rosemary, became pregnant. She refused to have an abortion, despite Paul's insistence. "This is your child too," she told him. Paul panicked. He couldn't risk another scandal. One evening, he visited Rosemary's apartment with a pack of juice. Pretending she was going to keep the pregnancy, they had another round of affair. Just to convince her, he had laced the juice with poison. After she drank it, few days later she fell ill and died. Paul made it look like a failed abortion. The church mourned her death, but no one suspected the truth. Paul preached at her funeral, his face a mask of sorrow. Paul hadn't touched his wife for months. She was even tired of complaining. The sight of her doesn't arouse him anymore. He will skip the family birthdays and anniversary just be around his mistress. His private guest house became his second home. Paul's life continued to spiral out of control. He used church vigils and meetings as excuses to spend nights with his mistresses. One night, after leaving a mistress's house, he was on his way to meet another when he had a terrible car accident. The crash left him paralyzed from the waist down. Confined to a wheelchair, Paul had time to reflect on his life. He felt the weight of his sins but couldn't bring himself to confess. He had a dream where he stood before the congregation, admitting everything. But when he woke up, he was too afraid to go through with it. Months passed, and Paul's guilt consumed him. He wrote a long letter, detailing all his sins, the affairs, the rape, the poisoning of Rosemary, and the secret son, Victor. He placed the letter in a sealed envelope and hid it in his desk. Then, he drank a poisonous substance, making his death look like heart failure. The church was devastated. They gave him a grand funeral, praising him as a man of God. Mrs. Mercy was heartbroken but also suspicious. After the burial, she found the letter. Mrs. Mercy sat alone in their home, holding the letter. Her hands trembled as she read Paul's confession. Tears streamed down her face as she realized the extent of his betrayal. She thought about the women he had hurt, the lives he had ruined. She also thought about the church and the people who had loved and trusted him. If she exposed the truth, it would destroy his legacy and hurt many people. But if she kept it hidden, the victims would never get justice. For days, Mrs. Mercy struggled with her decision. She prayed for guidance, asking God to show her the right path. Finally, she made her choice. She decided to keep the letter hidden, not to protect Paul, but to protect the innocent people who would be hurt by the truth. She burned the letter and vowed to live the rest of her life in honesty and faith, something Paul had failed to do. Years later, Mrs. Mercy continued to serve the church, but she did so with a renewed sense of purpose. She started a support group for women who had been abused or betrayed, offering them a safe space to heal. Victor, Paul's secret son, grew up and eventually found his way to the church. Mrs. Mercy took him in, treating him like her own. She never told him the truth about his father, but she made sure he grew up knowing love and kindness. Paul's story became a cautionary tale, not because it was exposed, but because Mrs. Mercy used it to inspire others to live better lives. She often told her congregation, "We are all human, and we all make mistakes. But it's never too late to choose the right path." And in her own way, she found peace. The end. Please drop your comments, share, and like this video. Kindly subscribe to my channel for more interesting stories.